Welcome to Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Good afternoon. Actually, it's good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on another bonus episode of Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Once again, in the bonus episodes, I told you before, I'm not joined with Matthew, my normal co-host, but I am thrilled today to have one of my good friends and mentors, Dr. Sandy Shugart, joining me. Dr. Shugart, Sandy was my boss, the former president of Valencia College. He has retired, but he is not retired. He's one of those people who realizes life is worth living and goes full throttle all the time. And he currently, amongst many other things, serves as a senior fellow for the Aspen Institute, as well as a senior fellow for Quo Vadis in Salzburg, Austria. That could be a whole conversation there, how that started. I've had the privilege of being there myself, visiting. They graciously gave my daughter Bryn some time in her gap year. But we're going to dive right in as we begin our conversation. But first, Sandy, how are you this morning?
I'm doing well, Carl. It's good to be with you.
Man, it is so good to see you. You are always on the move and doing a ton of cool stuff. And we used to have some very long conversations. Sandy is a mentor for me and someone who has graciously given me time and energy and support and love, advice, good advice, sometimes hard advice, which is what you need from a mentor. You need a mentor who's going to speak truth into your life, and I hope everybody listening has somebody like this. I'm privileged to have a few, but Sandy, if there was a Mount Rushmore in my life about people who are alive that I personally know who have guided and shaped me, Sandy would be on that monument in a deep way of someone who just made me who I am. If you don't like who I am, he's somebody you can blame because he's there. So if you've been listening to the podcast series, you know multiple times I've said things along the lines of, I probably need to go deeper there, but in interest of time, we didn't, and for various other reasons also. In episode 1 and in episode 3, and then a few other places through there, I have mentioned the Enlightenment, which is one of those big kind of historical topics that gets kind of thrown around at different times. And when I've usually said something along the lines of, we probably need to go deeper there. This comes out of, if you remember, examining my contention that our nation is in, the midst of a malaise and a lack of flourishing, both at sort of the larger civic level and in the lives of individuals. And that really began, in my opinion, after the decades after World War II. And as a part of that, the way I've described it is that there's a tension between two characters. There's the conservative on the one side, conservative Christian, maybe Christian nationalist, and on the other side, the progressive. And the two, they're kind of acting and reacting to one another. And in episode 1 and 3, one of the points that I kind of laid out was the fact that when you look at, in particular, a factor that is impacting the progressive character, the viewpoint, particularly amongst our young, I think, we come face to face with a concept that the Enlightenment and this idea of promises, like from the Enlightenment, sort of provide us it suggested things that I think people have suddenly decided or discovered have not come true. And I said then to Matthew, this is really something I need to talk about with an expert. And so I have brought my friend Sandy in. Now, Sandy probably will say in a second, don't call me an expert on this, but we've had mutual conversations many times in which we've talked about life and the kind of flourishing of in the modern world, often just in my own concerns for my students or in the classroom and when I was leading the church that I was leading. And so there's a sense in which, that's kind of always in the mix. So let me just stop there for a second, Sandy. You probably would not say, I, Sandy Shugart, am an expert in the Enlightenment, but you're still somebody I can turn to. But how would you describe, just in broad terms before we go further into the next question, just your thoughts about the Enlightenment and yourself, like that view of you as expert, me saying you're an expert.
Well, there's not many things I am an expert in. I'm neither a historian nor a philosopher, but I'm interested in how we came to be where we are and how we are. Most of my life has been spent first trained as a scientist and then as a leader in higher education. And so I spent really 40 years in the School of Hard Knocks learning how to lead in complex institutions. And it turns out that the besetting challenges of leaders in those environments, and all of us really who work and live in these complex, hugely scaled, distributed institutions, are essentially philosophical questions. They are questions of identity. Who am I? To whom do I belong? How do we function together? Can we have a community that coheres? And so on. And the roots of the answers to those, or at least the better questions around those things, are in fact philosophical roots, and they go back several hundred years now.
Yeah, and that's what in the podcast I've talked about it being our issue as a nation as a spiritual problem, but then I've tied that into an interiority that it's not like I personally don't believe it's going to quote unquote get better based on who we elect or decisions that are made by Congress. They're first something that's interior to the person. So I think that's in that idea of the philosophy and the philosophical space.
Yeah, I think that's true, and as you and I've talked before, Carl, what we're seeing is a longing for communities that can cohere, and yet in a very pluralistic environment, around what can you cohere? What are the centers around which our communities form and transform and lift one another up? And I think part of what's happened over the past century or so is that our pluralism has driven us to accommodations that might not have been the right way to respond to pluralism.
Yeah, that's good. Well, so in this, multiple times, in fact, I remember being in your office and you had a whiteboard in your office and you would sometimes say, oh, let me show you something. And you told me something. I want to say it might have been the very first time you told me this, and then I've certainly heard you say this multiple times in front of the faculty at, our annual conversations or some smaller groups conversations. And you would say this, and we'll quote you now, every pedagogy implies an anthropology. And then you'd often end up with a question afterwards when you were in front of the group, like, what's yours? In other words, you'd say to the listener, like, what's your anthropology? And I can tell you lots of times there was just scratching heads and people kind of looking to the side because you're asking a question that's insightful and kind of penetrates in a way that I think people hadn't thought about. But so, I think you're asking people at that point, like, how are they navigating modern life, but that kind of an idea. Where does that come from? Where did it come from for you, I guess? And then, how does this tie into this idea of a modern secular society or how we navigate such?
Yeah. So the question was borrowed. I heard it and it hit me like a ton of bricks from another educator. But it hit me so hard because it sort of hits us where we live. As a Christian, I think we often start conversations in the wrong place. We begin with our theology. And my basic rule now of evangelism and engagement is don't answer questions people aren't asking.
That's good.
Let's focus on the questions they really have, because that's what brings us together. We all have these questions. And the first questions people have are about themselves.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be human? How do I live a human life? And does it have any meaning? And where does that meaning come from? And so on. And it plays out in every part of our lives, including our work.
Yes.
And as you know, I've given lots of thought and written quite a bit about how to flourish at work and how work can form us or deform us, depending on how we engage it, particularly how we engage it in our interior lives. And so for a teacher, what I'm urging them is to say, if you haven't thought deeply about what it means to be human, what it means to be a human learner, and how learners experience the process of learning, and grown your practice as a teacher out of these deepest beliefs about what it means to be human, then you may actually just be a technician. You may be working off some checklist of good practices that were taught somewhere, the underlying anthropology of which you've never examined.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit like being a Jiffy Lube technician. You can do certain tasks if you follow them closely and if you're trained to do them well and if you're conscientious, and you might get some good results, but you're not going to diagnose a deep problem in your BMW.
Yeah.
You need a real engineer or a mechanic to do that. But it's also true in every other thing we do. So if you're in business, every system of performance evaluation and performance management, every employee review model, every incentive model that you build in your business compensation implies an anthropology. How are people motivated? What's your theory of motivation? What does it mean to be human? What really causes people to care deeply and to work hard and to share goals and so on? These are anthropological questions, and they run much deeper than just the instrumentality of how do I get more out of somebody.
Right.
They have to do with what does my work mean, not just how good are we at it. It's true in all parts of our life. And what I discovered in mining those questions, Carl, is that most of modern society is beset with a set of anthropologies that we haven't examined.
Yeah.
And they are inadequate to the task of guiding us through our lives. And they do have their roots largely in the late Middle Ages into the Enlightenment and all of the developments that have followed that in the West in how we understand that question. What does it mean to be human?
Yeah, that's good. Do you think people are afraid of the question? Or I guess I should say, I think people are afraid of the question. It's certainly, and it probably was a book by this name, An Unexamined Life. But then when you ask that question, I think it maybe it scares people. Not afraid may not be the right way to put it, but just sort of makes me nervous to think in those kinds of ways.
Well, I do think that that can be a daunting question for people, but it's largely one we avoid because it's hard to engage that conversation. We don't have a vocabulary for the conversation very well. So we have camps that have their own vocabularies.
Yes, that's true.
And they tend to marginalize people who aren't in the camp.
Yeah.
So, if you're a Christian nationalist, then you have a vocabulary that you think everybody else ought to master, and you know what you mean by it. But it may be completely impenetrable to folks who don't share that vocabulary and the history that goes with it. And there are many of those vocabularies. So it's you remember Churchill's comment about the English and the Americans being a common people divided by a common language.
Yes.
Two peoples divided by a common language. I think that language lies at the center of this because language signifies to people. So I think we need to find new language that isn't already loaded with incorrect or twisted and exaggerated meaning. And that's why I often start in conversation with other people whom I love and want to see flourish with language about what does it mean to be human rather than what do you believe. Right.
Well, so that gets to something else that you said multiple times, which I thought was just brilliant, and as I do with you're my mentor, so I'm copying and taking all these ideas. You said to change, I'm not going to get exactly right, I think, but to change the atmosphere, to change the direction of an organization, you have to change the conversation.
Yes.
And then you instilled within my experience, at least at the college, you instilled a willingness to be disciplined, to take the time to get to common definitions, to kind of pull back from maybe with the tension of what we're talking about to make sure we're thinking deeply, because words and definitions and how we use words and vocabulary all play such a critical role. I think that's often unexamined. I'm just finishing a wonderful book about the days leading up to the firing on Fort Sumter, which was our Civil War, of course, as you know. And one of the things that the author does a great job of pointing out repeatedly was how often the key players in the story had assumptions about themselves and about the other side that were unexamined, and they would simply just be working from, well, this is the way the world is, and they believed about something about the other side. And it's just reinforcing this idea of if we wish to know more, we have to be willing to step back and as the Gallup guys talked about, expand the pool of meaning and just really get in and think deeply about different things.
And that involves first a willingness to listen differently.
Absolutely.
And I think William Stafford is a favorite poet of mine. Once wrote, "We need to beat our megaphones into ear trumpets."
That's good. That's very good. So you mentioned the Middle Ages coming into the Renaissance, into the Enlightenment. I am on record as someone who is not, I don't want to say dismissive to the Enlightenment, but I guess I'm overly protective for the Renaissance. And that's more of as a historical or as a historian thinking about a field and this kind of a thing. But when we say the Enlightenment, just for the audience's sake, again, as a non-expert, and I say openly, the Renaissance was my major focus of study, that period roughly, let's say 1300s through, I think, into the 1600s, and that's where it begins to blend over when we do historical study about, okay, then the Enlightenment kind of picks up somewhere in there. Locke is often, so 1680s is often talked about as sort of the father and the godfather, but of the Enlightenment. So when you mention that and you think of the Enlightenment connected to this question of anthropology and finding our way forward, just real briefly, like how would you describe that in a sentence or two to someone from a sense of like, this is the Enlightenment, this is what I'm talking about when I'm trying to explain people our modern concerns?
Yeah. So they're much deeper thinkers and
Sure.
almost unreadably dense books on this that I've tried to master, but I don't claim mastery over them. Here's my layman's simple version of this, Carl. I would say what's important for this discussion is that in the Enlightenment, it was really the nursery in which a new conception of self was invented. And the idea was, rather than humans as creatures with a received morality and worldview by revelation and through the church from God, that we traded that in for an idea that we might be able to, in fact, impute the laws of nature and a morality from the laws of nature by the use of our rational faculties. It was a rebellion against dogma that began actually most powerfully in the Reformation.
Yes.
So the Reformation's healthy response to unbiblical and deeply politicized dogma in the church actually began to unshackle people from the idea that their morality, their way of engaging the world and navigating the world was going to be received. Instead, the idea was, can we construct it or discern it from nature?
Right.
Really, it started with discerning it from nature.
Right.
Can we impute from nature what the natural laws are that rather than having to receive those as revelation? It was a powerful and largely good thing. It freed us to inquire with the God-given rationality into all manner of things that were, sort of taboo subjects, for example. We could begin to ask questions about how the universe works.
Right.
It enabled science to go in directions that would have been completely blocked without that. But it also led to, over time, what Charles Taylor calls a buffered self, this conception of self as not connected, that the proper individual experience of life was a kind of an autonomous human being where nothing is received, where you're not particularly embedded in any institution like family, where you can choose, as my kids might have said in their teenage years, it's my movie, I'll write it any way I want.
Yeah, yes.
This sort of autonomous self that constructs meaning for oneself, that justifies oneself, that is not obliged to anything. And it's developed over the centuries into a promise, and the promise is the promise of utter freedom. Of the autonomous human being. You are your own. You belong to yourself. You don't owe anything to anyone else. You get to choose your obligations. And it has a false promise on many levels. For example, it leaves morality as something to be negotiated.
Right.
And it's not worked very well.
It has not worked well.
It leaves things like society to be negotiated. So there is no obligation from person to person. It's only a transaction in which I get to choose from moment to moment what's in my best interest.
Yeah.
It leads to a morality that's strictly utilitarian in the end, and dishonors everything that we would believe in a sacred anthropology, an anthropology that says there's something inherently valuable in human beings. It leads to a natural law that has no roots.
Yep.
So the references to natural law, even in our own Constitution, the inalienable rights, for example, have no roots. You can't derive them from anything. They're just constructed. They're invented, and so they don't hold up to pressure very well. So human rights becomes a negotiable issue, and all of this has grown up, step by step, little bit by little bit, into a set of assumptions about who I am and how I fit in the world that I think leave people adrift, and perhaps more importantly, miss the truth of the human experience. And so a good bit of my work is grounded in trying to understand a renewed anthropology.
Yeah.
If we believe that humans have inherent dignity and value, then where does it come from?
Right.
And how is that exercised in everyday life?
Yeah, and that last part is, I think, in one sense, I would say central to my overall thesis of the podcast and the work that I've been on, is that we have forgotten that was ever a question, and we've been afraid individually and perhaps collectively to examine that. Probably in one sense because of what you said earlier, in the sense of different camps having predetermined definitions for things and unwilling to listen to my neighbor and realize I am in a pluralistic society and then have to kind of think through that. But it kind of plays into again, in episode 1, when I lay out our problems, at least as I see them, and the sort of starting with the addiction to comfort and ease, but then tying into that this individualism that then is embedded with this postmodern position of I can kind of construct, to use your phrase, myself or my own set of values and rules and things. I mean, that all sounds fine, except it hasn't worked. And that's kind of where we are now at this point, 250 years later.
And there's some fundamental things wrong with it, the reasons why it hasn't worked. One is that the vision of human flourishing that produces is one of individualism.
Right.
And so flourishing becomes me and my flourishing, not ours. So again, Taylor calls this being disembedded. I think a sacred anthropology would say, no, you're born into a set of obligations. You live in a thickly webbed moral environment all the time. That's the language of Christian Smith, a wonderful sociologist. We are deeply indebted to one another, to creation, to the Creator, and so on. And declaring our autonomy simply leaves us adrift. You actually discover real freedom in understanding what those obligations are and choosing to exercise love through those obligations rather than to cut yourself free and say, I'm going to go invent my own life.
Yeah, I think that's where Wendell Berry's at with the idea of the valuing of the community and the valuing of the local, and not attempting to see your life in a beyond, but instead the value or the reason of my life, or maybe a key purpose of my life is in this acceptance of the connection with all my neighbors, of which I have shared history and kind of shared life with. And again, I think Berry would say, and has written a lot on this, we've lost all that. We've disconnected from the land. We've disconnected from our other, even our own families. I mean, now family is very much a negotiated thing in which many people feel little obligation in those connections with the other.
Yes, I think if you go back and say, so what are the working anthropologies that people are operating out of, even if they're unexamined, and they tend to be, from the academic side, either sort of homo economicus, that is, all human beings are essentially economic animals,
Sure.
and they're trying to optimize their place in the world. And flourishing is when everybody gets what they want.
Yeah.
And then the competing one is homo determinus, which no one lives by. That is, as organisms, everything we do is actually determined. The idea that we're making free choices is an illusion, a dream, a fantasy. This really comes more out of a biological determinism, and the development of the sciences is this idea that there really isn't a consciousness and there really isn't a will, that these are all just fabrications. No one lives their life that way, including the most ardent determinists exercise will in every choice they make. Those are kind of the dominant academic anthropologies. I would say the dominant sort of popular anthropology is already expressed here. It's my movie. I'll write it any way I want.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of responsible for making myself happy. I'm sort of responsible for having a life other people will admire, whoever my tribe is. And I'm going to spend myself trying to do that, building my brand, doing all those sorts of things. And, these anthropologies don't deal with the essential human questions.
Right.
And those questions are, does this mean anything? Is consciousness real? Does my life have purpose? Is there telos, purpose in the universe, which I can align? Why is there so much suffering? Why has the Enlightenment promised that if we just get enough knowledge, we can put an end to suffering? Why has that not panned out?
Yep.
Is knowledge not enough? Those are the questions that the working anthropologies aren't answering. Sometimes, Carl, when I'm in a group, I remember doing this with a group of pediatric heart surgeons once in Poland, and we're having these conversations. And the philosophical discourse, especially when you're doing it across language barriers, doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
So I'll make it really plain for them. So I remember in this group that was struggling with medical ethical questions, and I wanted to get them to the anthropology underlying their ethics. So there was a woman in the middle of the room of about the right age. I said, do you have children? And she said, yeah. I said, how many? 2. I said, how valuable are your children? Oh, they're very, very valuable. I said, really? Only very, very valuable? She said, okay, they're infinitely valuable. I said, your children are infinitely valuable. Why? What makes them valuable? I understand they're valuable to you.
Yep.
You love them. Is that the source of their valuable, that they're loved? Are unloved people unvaluable? No. They're all valuable. I said, okay. And your neighbor's children, how valuable are they? They're infinitely valuable. Your neighbor's child with Down syndrome, how valuable? Infinitely valuable. Why? Well, they just are. Why? What makes them valuable?
Yep.
This is the anthropological question.
Right.
And I think the answer that she's reaching for when she was struggling with me was close at hand, but she didn't know how to articulate it, or maybe lived in a culture where it was inarticulable. Her child is valuable because she's loved, but not by her.
Right. Yep.
She lives in an environment created by and loved by the Creator. And the infinite value of that child comes from its source and God's love. And that's true of all of us. It's true of the most ardent enemy of God. It's true of the most deeply guilty. It's true of all of us. So there's a sense in which if you can get the conversation back to the ultimate questions, then you end with this sort of ultimate tensions that people have to navigate, and that's where the real conversation lies. We are ultimately worthy and ultimately unworthy at the same time.
Yeah.
And to get back to the main subject of your conversation, this is where the modern outlook, modernity, secularism, this notion of exclusive humanism, I think is the language Charles Taylor used for it, fails us, is that it doesn't have answers for any of those questions.
Yeah, because as you said earlier, and also elsewhere with me, there's a sense in which the deeper thinking or the spirituality, the interior life was banished, certainly in the continental thinkers. who we most famously know in the Enlightenment. I'm always interested that, and I know you've been there recently, how the Scottish Enlightenment took a very different tack as they kept a balance, and they had such a deeper impact on the United States. I'm convinced that that's a key reason why, at least early in our national history, this sense of an embedded idea of faith and Christianity was maintained. A large portion of both the people at the signing of the Declaration or the creation of the Declaration and the Constitution were Scots, had been educated in the Scottish model, and Madison was certainly one who we famously know, and he was educated by Witherspoon, who coming from Scotland. So the Scots did a better job of kind of keeping that balance.
When that balance consisted of dealing with the plurality of ways of knowing in ways that were different from the continent. So on the continent, essentially spiritual and moral reflection were banished from the conversation because
Correct.
There was no basis of authority to say these are the truths around which we organize. It happened in Scotland that they made theology, as they said, the queen of the sciences.
Yep.
What does that mean? It meant that all the various ways of knowing in the curriculum, if we can describe it sort of in higher ed terms, that is the scientific and natural history ways of knowing, the political ways of knowing, the aesthetic and creative ways of knowing, the historical ways of, these are all different modes of inquiry, the humanistic ways of knowing. All of these can flourish together, but for them to integrate, you have to have essentially spiritual and moral reflection.
Yes.
That's where these ideas come together and get related to one another. And they kept them together in the Scottish university, particularly St. Andrews and the other Scottish universities.
Yeah.
And they really were the ancestors of the American universities. So we didn't model Harvard, Yale, Princeton, even William and Mary after University of Paris or Bologna.
Right.
They were modeled really after St. Andrews and the other Scottish universities, even more than say Oxford and Cambridge.
Correct. Yeah.
That's why we didn't have a tutorial model.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But what happened very quickly in the United States, meaning in the first century or century and a half of the development of the university, and particularly into the late 18th century and early 19th century, is that we responded in higher education to pluralism by banishing spiritual and moral reflection. Since we didn't have a common code, a common set of beliefs, rather than engaging spiritual reflection as a faculty, a capacity for reasoning about these different ways of knowing, we just said, we can't get comfortable with you, so you're no longer a part of the curriculum. We'll only study religion as a sociological phenomenon.
Right.
But we're not going to engage in actual religious or spiritual contemplation of what we're learning in physics.
Yeah, no longer was it the integrating force of alls. It was just now one of the discrete little things you could or could not choose to study.
That's right. And what we mean by integrating force is not a template in which we had to hammer all the other truth into because this was our dogmatic framework.
Right.
But a way of engaging in conversation and reflection that opens the door to different possibilities. I wonder what this means. I wonder how this could be. Where could this have come from? These are deeper questions that relate the different modes of inquiry and knowledge. And we've largely lost that first in our universities and among the intelligentsia, the framers, for example. But now it's sort of a part of common life, which is in mass culture in the West, the idea is we're never going to agree on this stuff. So you got one of two choices. You can either not bring it up, sort of dismiss it as no longer relevant, or you can go to war.
Yeah.
And the culture wars are a direct reflection. They're the other end of the spectrum and devastatingly damaging to the development of community and to the gospel, I would add.
Yeah.
The culture wars are a disaster, just as abnegation of all things spiritual is a disaster. There's this whole middle ground where we engage in deep conversation, deep listening, deep consideration of truth and ways of knowing that come from all different directions to try to understand how does a a way of reflecting biblically on this inform our theology and our anthropology and our morality and our sense of community and obligation to one another.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking. I'm thinking you and I both, you at a much deeper level, have spent over 3 decades of thinking about not so much reforming the education, but just how can education be better. And I'm just struck at how often my experience as a professor is one that it is for the students extraordinarily discrete and not in any way integrated, even though we as a college, by your leadership, wrestled with the idea of a common core or kind of a common path. And I personally would not say we ever achieved arriving, and it still ended up being a very discrete set of check marks. I go through these and I get this, and I need to move on to whatever it is I want to study as the student. And the student then leaves not integrated as a whole, but discrete in various parts. And I think that's not just like somehow our college's fault. It's actually a longer conversation, which we don't have to get into, but just I reflect on it thinking in terms of one of my core outcomes or solutions is the fact that we have to get back to being willing to educate our children about a common sense of moral and virtue, which I think can be separated out from any specific religion. But the idea of that, not for asking you to reflect on that point, but just the idea being that we want education is to create the next citizens, and we want them to be whole and flourishing. And clearly, our children, and I'm thinking now of everybody, even my age, 60 and younger, who have gone through the education system of the past 60 years, do not, to me, appear to be flourishing and or whole in that process.
So what happened, I think, in part, is that idea that knowledge will deliver us.
Right.
Right. So that is a deeply Enlightenment rationalist sort of notion.
Part of the myth.
And it's a part of, we've talked about this before, this sort of subtraction myth.
Yeah.
That
dig into that
Taylor,
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So all worldviews, all ways of looking at things have at their core a set of mythologies. The mythologies may be true, false, somewhere in between, but whatever your way of looking at the world is, I promise you there are mythologies at the core of it. So one of the mythologies at the core of modernity is this notion of a subtraction myth, that humans as progressing rational animals that are getting better through evolution, both the cultural and biological evolution, will eventually shed the need for superstition. And so religion is doomed. It was just inevitable that the Enlightenment would arise, that we would become hyper-rational, that we would let go of all this sort of mumbo-jumbo and speculation about things we can't see and measure, and that would be a good thing. There's still, the new atheists making that argument that religion is the problem because it's holding us back. Well, this is a myth. I think it's an easily debunked myth.
Me too.
And there are many now who are actually describing Western society as post-secular, which is to say, religion hasn't died. Church attendance has died in the United States, but worldwide, particularly in the developed world, religions of all types are on the rise.
Correct.
There's an enormous, robust religious sensibility in human beings that hasn't been extinguished by the development of knowledge. Secondly, all that new knowledge hasn't solved our problem.
Correct.
In fact, it's magnified the destructive power of our real problem. And the real problem is that we're all flawed.
Yes.
And suffering continues because human beings are profoundly flawed, and we can't fix ourselves. No matter how hard we try, we don't seem, at scale anyway, to be able to fix ourselves. And those problems still need to be in front of people. In the places where, like colleges and universities, where we are meant to equip people, because, again, of this sort of plurality of opinions and values, we doubled down on knowledge by hyper-specialization. And and I think almost without asking the question, lost the idea that education ought to make us wiser, and that requires an integrative education, not a dissociated, hyper-specialized. And so now we've got the situation where if you're fully into the secular modern mindset, you've got to believe that specialists, technocrats, will save the universe.
Yeah.
That somehow, this technocrat will solve human health issues. That one will solve human mental health issues. Another one will invent a drug that makes us less selfish. I don't know why we think technical solutions will solve what we know are not technical problems. They're problems of character, morality, and so on. So we need, again, to rethink our anthropology, to go deep again and say, if the seeds of a kind of a broken anthropology were planted in the Enlightenment, some other seeds also were planted that are bearing good fruit. So let's not treat this as we lost a golden age.
Yes, yeah. There's no golden age.
Remember, the seeds of both the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were planted in the Black Plague.
Correct.
So there were bad things back then.
Yeah.
So, but I think recalling people to the core conversation and saying, okay, what is it that makes human beings valuable? What does it mean to be human? And going to that direction. I think the language of C.S. Lewis has always been helpful to me there, where he says, you remember, you've never met an ordinary person.
Correct.
There's no such thing.
Yeah.
When I'm talking about this, often with audiences in Europe, where our stilted religious language doesn't get much traction, but the truth does.
Yes.
So I'll sometimes present the gospel this way and say, after all my years of study, I think there are only two ways to look at the universe. One is to say, look around. Everyone you see, everyone you know will be gone in a minute. Human beings are mortal and our time is short. And we know this about ourselves, though we don't like to think about it. And if that's true, if we're here only for a moment, then what must matter, what must give meaning to our lives is what we leave behind.
Yeah.
The legacy we create, the poems we write, the wealth we accumulate, the societies we build, whatever your notion of legacy might be. And this is a very winsome value proposition to people because we know our mortality.
Yeah, that's good.
This is called materialism. And the problem with it is that in the end, you can justify almost any harm to another human being on the basis of some legacy you think is important.
Yep.
And it's been the justification for every evil leader
Yes.
throughout our history.
Yep.
That the ends justify the means. The other way of looking at the universe is to say, look around. Everything you see is temporary. It's all going to go away. The second law of thermodynamics is hard to resist.
Yes.
In some way, everything, every material thing is temporary. What isn't, maybe, is the person sitting across the table from you.
Yeah, that's good.
We've all entertained this hypothesis that there's something about personhood that endures, even when the body doesn't.
Yeah.
And in my faith tradition, we express it much more directly. But you don't have to be there yet.
Yep.
Have you been willing to entertain that hypothesis? Is it possible that the universe at the end of the day, as one poet said, isn't composed of atoms, it's composed of stories?
Yeah, that's good.
Is it possible that there's person behind things? Is that why you feel this value and dignity towards the people you love? Is this what gives your life meaning and direction? And if so, then that's the place you inquire. Where does all this come from?
Yeah, that's
What
good.
does it mean? This is called, let's call that personalism.
Oh, I like it.
Okay? So personalism asserts there's something deeply important about our consciousness, our personhood, and raises the possibility that person with a capital P might be behind everything.
Yeah.
This is, if you'll allow me to say it this way, the mythology behind faith, particularly the Christian faith. I think is a true mythology.
Yep.
I can't prove it, but I can suggest there are reasons to entertain it, and that belief in it is warranted. There's enough evidence to take this seriously. And to me, that's the conversation that leads to a renewed, and I would say a sacred anthropology, where we begin to say, this is what it means to be human, and lay that out in some detail. And with that renewed anthropology, we're in a position to renew many other things. We can examine every process, system, institution, power structure with that question in mind. How does this align to our sacred anthropology?
Yeah, that's good. You're anticipating what I believe will be season 2. Actually, I've been thinking a lot about doing a season 2 of Unmoored, and it's going to be that examination of, the way I've said it, similar to you, is there's a real story, but we do have, there's a reason to examine it. And as a historian, I kind of want to dig into it. Now, you've kind of done what I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask one last question, and this is the closing out, but you kind of did it. So feel free just to be short, and if there's any more you want to add. I've been suggesting that part of the churn is particularly within the focus of where you and I have spent our lifetimes, which is working with young people. And I think they are aware of this disillusionment. I've certainly heard this in the classroom. And you won't remember this, but one time you and I were on a long walk from your office. It used to be downtown and here in Orlando. And we were talking, and after listening to me moan and complain and share some things, you said, I hear you being disillusioned. And I said, oh, yes, that's exactly it. And you said, good. And I remember being slightly offended. I mean, we're kind of like, what? And then you said to me, disillusion, think of the word, is to be at the end of illusion. And I thought, wow. And I've used that a million times. So when you know that you have this group of young people in front of you who seem to be disillusioned, certainly about the Enlightenment Project, maybe about life as they find it, even certainly I think illusioned about the idea of a transcendent that's been marginalized. They've moved into cynicism, depression. There's obviously a great concern even worldwide about suicide, particularly amongst young people where it's not normally. As you close out here, and again, your time is so important and I value it so much. What advice, besides what you just shared, which was brilliant, any short advice or anything you'd want to say to a group of students? So think of the 18 to 22-year-olds who would be in a classroom about how they can or should move forward together or in their lives.
Yeah. So the first thing is to commend you if you're disillusioned, because it is true that a spell has been cast on almost all of us. The spell has utilitarian motives. It's to get us to be manipulable so that we buy and spend and consume in ways that make other people prosperous. But the spell tells you that you are responsible for your own story, that you are autonomous, free, and that you have to justify yourself, that you essentially need to write your movie. And what you're given is a blank page. And so you see people frantically trying to justify themselves with what they own, with what they project, with the tribe they affiliate with. With the symbols around them. Their identity is plastic. This thing has no roots. It's a big sales job. And people exhaust that pretty quickly. And if this is all there is, me trying to impress other people, or some subset of the other people, then I'm out. And people are tapping out. Some are tapping out ultimately. My message to them would be, there's another way of looking at your life. You need to be disenchanted with the spell that's been cast on you and enchanted with a different spell for a while.
Oh, that's good.
And what I would suggest is that many of us believe you already belong, that your sense of alienation is the first step towards understanding to whom you really belong and to what you really belong. And that what you belong to, who you belong to, is larger than yourself, is inherent, isn't negotiable. It is a life of connection, and that we call, particularly in the letters of St. John, we call this person to whom you belong love.
Yes.
God is love. So we used to chant this in my Anglo-Catholic days. In Latin, we'd say, ubi caritas et amor, ubi caritas Deus ibi est. is Latin for where there is love, where there is charity. That's where God is. There is a whole universe fabricated by the lover of and creator of the universe to which you belong. And your connection to it is a loving connection. And you are valuable because God loves you, not because other people are impressed with you. And your journey through this life is a journey of discovering that love. Yeah. Ask the right questions. I'm happy to provide you my answers, but I'd much rather you ask the right questions.
Yeah. That's great, Sandy. Wow, that's so good. Man, thank you so much. I appreciate you spending time with us here in this bonus episode of the podcast, and I look forward to our private future conversations. And if anybody has any questions out there for us, feel free, as always, to put them in the comments or send them my way through the email, which is the information's in the podcast. All right. See you, buddy.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.